When the stock market collapsed in 1929, plunging America into the Great Depression, millions of families suddenly found themselves in a fight for survival. Factories closed their doors, banks went under, and men and women who had once known stability were now in breadlines, clutching ration books and hoping tomorrow would be better. It was a time when even the simplest luxuries like sugar, eggs, and milk felt as precious as gold. And yet, in kitchens across America, there was a quiet revolution happening. Out of scarcity came creativity, out of hunger came invention, and out of despair came desserts that managed to comfort an entire nation. The Great Depression wasn't just a story of loss. It was also a story of resilience told through kitchens that smelled faintly of molasses, cinnamon, and wood smoke. Mothers, grandmothers, and even children learned to stretch every ingredient, to turn almost nothing into something, and to transform the humblest staples into sweet morsels of hope. These desserts weren't extravagant. They weren't layered confections dripping in cream and sugar, but they were powerful in their simplicity, delivering not just nourishment, but also a sense of normalcy and joy when the world outside felt bleak. If you've ever wanted to taste history, to hold in your hands the very recipes that carried a generation through its darkest hours, this is your chance. Stay with us as we rediscover 20 Great Depression desserts that got America through hard times. Share this story with your family, pass it along to friends, and maybe even try recreating one of these old-fashioned recipes in your own kitchen. Because these aren't just sweets, they're living pieces of history, carrying with them the voices, struggles, and triumphs of a people who refuse to give up. Baking through the storm. The story of dessert in the 1930s is one of ingenuity. While today's kitchens overflow with butter, chocolate, and cream, Depression-era kitchens were often starkly bare. With unemployment soaring and money scarce, many families couldn't afford to splurge on luxuries. Rationing and shortages meant that staples like eggs and sugar were carefully measured out, sometimes saved for weeks just to bake something special. Yet, despite these limitations, families still found ways to bring sweetness to their tables. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about survival wrapped in tradition. Desserts became a way to stretch what little there was, to make children smile even when bellies weren't always full, and to create community at potlucks, church socials, and family gatherings. These recipes weren't just about flavor, they were about resilience, about reminding one another that joy could still be found in something as small as a slice of pie or a cookie warm from the oven. The desserts of the Great Depression also reveal the roots of American food culture. They showed how immigrants adapted old-world traditions to new-world hardships. They highlighted the resourcefulness of rural farmers who relied on what they could grow or preserve. And they captured the creativity of urban families who found ways to replicate expensive ingredients with clever substitutes. To taste a Depression-era dessert today is to taste the very spirit of survival. Vinegar pie, the tangy stand-in. When citrus was scarce and expensive, home cooks turned to vinegar as an ingenious substitute. Vinegar pie became a symbol of Depression-era resourcefulness, taking something as ordinary as vinegar and transforming it into a bright, tangy custard. Its appearance on kitchen tables across America was a testament to the determination to preserve traditions even when the ingredients seemed out of reach. The recipe was simple yet effective. A crust, often made from flour and lard rather than butter, cradled a filling of sugar, water, flour, and vinegar, sometimes enriched with an egg if the household was lucky enough to have one. The vinegar gave the pie an unexpected brightness, mimicking the sharp tang of lemon. Families would cut into the pie with a sense of anticipation, knowing it was more than just dessert. It was a clever trick, a culinary sleight of hand that made them feel less deprived. For children who had never tasted a true lemon pie, vinegar pie became the standard. And for adults who remembered better days, it offered a bittersweet reminder of how far they had come. In many homes, vinegar pie became a Sunday tradition, a humble treat that reminded families of resilience and ingenuity. Mock apple pie, crackers in disguise. Few desserts capture the spirit of the Depression like mock apple pie. Born from a longing for apples that were either too costly or unavailable, this dessert was made with Ritz crackers, cinnamon, sugar, and a splash of vinegar or lemon juice if it could be spared. The crackers, softened during baking, mimicked the texture of cooked apples so convincingly that many diners were fooled. The brilliance of mock apple pie lay in its familiarity. Apple pie was, and still is, the quintessential American dessert, tied to identity, tradition, and comfort. By recreating it with nothing more than pantry staples, families found a way to cling to a sense of normalcy. It was more than a pie, it was hope disguised as dessert. Mothers would proudly serve it at Sunday dinners, smiling as children devoured their slices, none the wiser to the fact that no apples had been harmed in the making of this pie. And neighbors gathered together for potlucks would marvel at how such a convincing imitation could be conjured from something as humble as crackers. Mock apple pie wasn't just dessert, it was resilience wrapped in pastry. Wacky cake, the eggless, milkless. Wonder. Of all the Depression-era desserts, wacky cake has perhaps enjoyed the longest legacy. Known also as crazy cake or depression cake, it was beloved for being both simple and indulgent, a rare combination in hard times. The recipe required no eggs, no butter, and no milk, luxuries many families simply could not afford. Instead, it used vinegar and baking soda for leavening, or oil for moisture, and cocoa powder for flavor. The cake was often mixed right in the pan, a process that fascinated children. Dry ingredients went in first, then small wells were made to pour in vinegar, oil, and water. When stirred together, the mixture bubbled and foamed, a bit of kitchen magic that brought delight even before the cake was baked. Once out of the oven, the result was a moist, chocolatey cake that felt like pure indulgence in a world that had so little. Families often saved wacky cake for birthdays or other special occasions, stretching every ingredient to make the day memorable. For many children, it was the first chocolate cake they ever tasted, and it held a magic that no bakery cake could rival. Even today, wacky cake recipes are passed down through families, a sweet reminder of how creativity triumphed over scarcity. Oatmeal cookies. Stretching the pantry. Cookies were a luxury during the Depression, but oatmeal made them possible. Oats were inexpensive, filling, and nutritious, making them a favorite ingredient for thrifty bakers. Oatmeal cookies required less flour, fewer eggs, and less butter than traditional cookies, which made them ideal for stretching limited resources. Molasses often took the place of refined sugar, giving the cookies a deep, rich flavor. Sometimes raisins or nuts were added when they were available, but often the cookies were served plain. They weren't lavish, but they were satisfying, a small indulgence that felt bigger than it was. In many families, oatmeal cookies were made in large batches and shared generously. They went into lunch pails, were handed out to neighbors, and became staples at church gatherings. For children, they were a treat that could brighten even the hardest days. For parents, they were proof that love and care could be baked into something as simple as oats and molasses. Water pie, dessert on a shoestring. Perhaps the most astonishing dessert of the Great Depression was water pie. Its name alone speaks to the scarcity of the times. Made with nothing more than water, sugar, flour, and a bit of butter. If it could be spared, water pie defied expectations by turning the most basic ingredients into something resembling custard. The filling was poured into a pie crust and baked until it set into a tender, slightly sweet dessert. It wasn't elaborate, but it carried with it a sense of wonder. The fact that water, a symbol of necessity and survival, could become dessert was nothing short of remarkable. For families who had nearly nothing left in the pantry, water pie was more than food. It was a lifeline. It was proof that even in the bleakest of times, there was room for sweetness. Parents took pride in serving it, and children who may not have known the difference between water pie and richer custards devoured it with joy. Cornmeal pudding. The humble staple cornmeal pudding has deep roots in American history, stretching back to colonial kitchens, but it found renewed importance during the Depression. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and widely available, making it a cornerstone of survival cooking. The pudding was made by simmering cornmeal with water or milk, sweetened with molasses, and flavored with spices like cinnamon or nutmeg when they were available. The result was hearty and comforting, with a rustic sweetness that lingered on the tongue. Cornmeal pudding was often served warm on Sundays, offering families a sense of tradition and continuity. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and in a time when hunger was a constant worry that mattered most. Families cherished it not just for its flavor, but for the sense of stability it provided in an uncertain world. Prune pudding. Sweetness from simplicity. Prunes were inexpensive and widely available, making them an essential source of sweetness during the Depression. Prune pudding, made by simmering prunes until soft and blending them into a thick, sweet mixture, was a common dessert in households across America. The pudding could be flavored with cinnamon, vanilla, or a splash of lemon if available, but even in its simplest form, it was nourishing and satisfying. Parents valued it for its nutritional content. Prunes provided fiber and vitamins that were otherwise hard to come by. Children loved it because it was sweet, and in those days, sweetness of any kind was a luxury. Prune pudding also carried a sense of connection to the past. Many immigrants had brought similar recipes with them from Europe, and in adapting them to Depression-era kitchens, families preserved both heritage and hope. From vinegar pies that mimicked lemons to water pies that turned scarcity into comfort, the desserts of the Great Depression tell a story of survival written in sugar and flour. Each one reflects the creativity, resilience, and love of families who refused to let hardship steal all their joy. These desserts weren't about extravagance. They were about small victories, proof that even in times of scarcity, sweetness could still be found. And this is only half the journey. Next, we'll explore even more Depression-era desserts, from fried doughs to fruit cobblers, cakes made from nearly nothing, and the creative confections that kept spirits alive. If part 1 has stirred your curiosity, or maybe even your appetite, don't stop here. Share these stories with loved ones, dust off those old cookbooks, and join us for the rest of this journey. Because the story of the Great Depression isn't just about hardship, it's about the sweet strength that carried a nation through. Fried dough, sweetness from flour and oil. When money was tight and cupboards bare, fried dough became a go-to dessert. With little more than flour, water, and a bit of fat for frying, families could create a warm golden treat that filled stomachs and lifted spirits. Rolled into rough shapes, fried until puffed, and dusted with sugar when it was available, fried dough wasn't fancy, but it was delicious in its simplicity. In immigrant communities, fried dough took on many forms. Italian families made zeppole, Greek households turned to loukoumades, and Native American fry bread also found its way onto tables. In each case, the humble dough transformed into a reminder of culture, family, and togetherness. Children loved watching the dough bubble and crisp in the pan, and parents loved how such a small amount of ingredients could stretch into enough dessert for everyone. Fried dough was more than sustenance. It was a celebration. In households where money was scarce, it was one of the few times laughter and the smell of frying dough could fill the kitchen, reminding families that sweetness didn't have to be expensive. Molasses cake. Dark, sticky comfort. Molasses was one of the unsung heroes of the Depression. Cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with flavor, it became the backbone of many desserts, including the beloved molasses cake. This dark, sticky cake carried a depth of flavor that white sugar alone could never provide. Its richness made it feel indulgent, even when the recipe was simple. Mothers often baked molasses cake on Sundays, filling the home with its earthy aroma. Served plain, dusted with a bit of sugar, or drizzled with thin icing when there was time, molasses cake was both practical and comforting. Children eagerly devoured slices, licking sticky fingers, while adults savored its heartiness with a cup of coffee or tea. Beyond its taste, molasses cake symbolized thrift. A single jar could flavor weeks' worth of baking, stretching family budgets without sacrificing joy. For many, molasses cake was the taste of childhood, its flavor inseparably tied to memories of perseverance. Apple brown, Betty old-fashioned warmth. When apples were available, they were treasured. Apple Brown Betty was a way to stretch them further by layering slices with breadcrumbs or stale bread, sugar, and spices before baking until tender and golden. The result was something between a pudding and a pie, warm, sweet, and fragrant with cinnamon. This dessert was beloved because it required no pie crust, no eggs, and no fancy equipment, just a simple baking dish and the will to make something comforting out of almost nothing. Families often served it with a drizzle of cream or a dollop of evaporated milk when they had it, though it was delicious enough to stand on its own. Apple Brown Betty reminded families of abundance, even when apples were scarce. Every bite was a reminder that joy could be coaxed out of the humblest ingredients, and that the act of baking together mattered just as much as the end result. Rice pudding, a bowl of comfort. Rice pudding was another Depression staple, turning inexpensive grains into a filling dessert. Made by simmering rice with milk or water, if milk wasn't available, sweetened with sugar or molasses, and flavored with cinnamon, nutmeg, or even a splash of vanilla, rice pudding was warm, comforting, and endlessly adaptable. For many families, it became a way to stretch leftovers. Yesterday's rice could easily become today's dessert, transformed with just a few extra ingredients. Children loved its creamy texture and subtle sweetness, while parents appreciated its practicality and nourishment. Rice pudding also had cultural roots, with recipes varying among immigrant communities. Some added raisins, others preferred a thicker custard-like texture, and still others served it chilled as a summer treat. Regardless of variation, rice pudding was proof that thrift and comfort could coexist. Depression-era donuts, a sweet morning treat. Donuts were far from new in the 1930s, but the Depression reshaped how they were made. Instead of yeast-raised donuts requiring time and ingredients, families often made baking powder donuts, which could be fried quickly with fewer resources. They were smaller, denser, and often rolled in sugar if sugar was available. These donuts were often served on Sundays or at special gatherings where the smell of frying dough brought people together. Neighbors might share batches, and children waited eagerly for the warm rings to be dusted and cooled enough to eat. In many ways, Depression-era donuts were symbolic of community. They weren't extravagant, but they carried with them the joy of sharing, of making do, and of reminding one another that even in hard times, life could still be sweet. Custard with evaporated milk. Eggs and fresh milk were luxuries during the Depression, but evaporated milk provided a solution. Custards made with evaporated milk became popular, their creamy texture and gentle sweetness making them feel indulgent, despite their humble origins. These custards were often baked in small dishes or jars, flavored with nutmeg or vanilla when available. Families treasured them not just for their flavor, but for their nutritional value, providing protein and calcium in a time when both were scarce. For many children, custard was one of the few creamy desserts they experienced during those years, making it unforgettable. Parents took pride in making something so nourishing feel so special, even when the pantry was nearly bare. Cobblers and crisps. Fruit, made to stretch. Fruit was precious, but cobblers and crisps made it stretch further. With just a handful of apples, berries, or peaches, families could create a dessert large enough to feed a table. The fruit was tossed with sugar and sometimes a bit of flour, then topped with biscuit dough, oats, or crumbs before baking until bubbly and golden. Cobblers and crisps were versatile, working with whatever fruit was available, fresh, dried, or canned. They were also deeply comforting, served warm and filling the kitchen with their aroma. For many families, they became the centerpiece of Sunday meals, proof that dessert didn't require abundance. It required creativity. Even today, cobblers and crisps carry with them the spirit of the Depression. Simple, adaptable, and comforting. Each spoonful tells a story of stretching what you have and finding joy in the act of sharing. Bread pudding. Nothing wasted. Perhaps no dessert better represents the ethos of the Great Depression than bread pudding. Nothing was wasted, not even stale bread. Instead, it was soaked in milk, sweetened with sugar or molasses, spiced with cinnamon, and baked until it became soft, warm, and deeply comforting. Bread pudding was practical, but it was also beloved. Families passed down recipes, each adding their own twist, raisins, a splash of coffee, or even a drizzle of syrup when they could. Children eagerly devoured it, never seeing it as leftovers, but as dessert worthy of anticipation. In many ways, bread pudding was more than just food. It was a lesson in thrift, in gratitude, and in finding joy where others might see scarcity. It was a reminder that nothing had to go to waste and that even in hard times, transformation was possible. Peanut butter cookies. Protein meets sweetness. Peanut butter, affordable and filling, became a staple during the Depression. It was nutritious, packed with protein, and could be used in countless ways, including cookies. Peanut butter cookies, made with flour, sugar, and just a bit of fat, were rich, flavorful, and satisfying. Children loved their crumbly texture and nutty flavor, while parents valued their simplicity. Peanut butter cookies often carried the iconic crisscross pattern pressed with a fork, a sign of familiarity that brought comfort during uncertain times. Beyond taste, peanut butter cookies symbolized ingenuity, turning a staple ingredient into something special. They were small, but they carried with them the sweetness of hope. Applesauce cake. Moisture without luxury. Fresh ingredients were scarce, but applesauce, whether homemade or store-bought, offered a way to add moisture and sweetness to baked goods without using butter or eggs. Applesauce cake became a staple dessert, spiced with cinnamon and cloves, its tender crumb making it feel more indulgent than it was. For many families, applesauce cake was a Sunday tradition, baked in simple pans and served warm. Its aroma filled kitchens with a sense of abundance, even when ingredients were limited. Leftovers, if there were any, were cherished for lunches during the week. Applesauce cake was more than dessert. It was proof that substitution could lead to something memorable. It showed how even in the toughest of times, creativity could turn scarcity into tradition. From fried dough sizzling in cast-iron pans to bread pudding born of leftovers, the desserts of the Great Depression were more than recipes. They were symbols of survival. Each one carries with it the resilience of families who refused to let hardship erase joy, who found ways to sweeten life even in its darkest chapters. Desserts during the Depression were not about extravagance. They were about connection. They were about gathering at the table, sharing what little there was, and finding comfort in the act of eating together. They remind us that food is not just sustenance. It is memory, culture, and resilience woven into every bite. As we look back on these 20 Great Depression desserts, let's do more than just remember. Let's honor the resilience they represent by keeping their stories alive. Share them with your family, cook them in your own kitchen, and remind yourself that even in times of scarcity, creativity and love can transform the simplest of ingredients into something extraordinary. The next time you bite into a slice of vinegar pie or savor a spoonful of rice pudding, remember, these aren't just desserts. They are history on a plate.